Hi everyone, I'm Luke Hector and this is The Broken Meeple, a show where I devote my time to ranting and raving about board games, but usually more the ranting part. We'll get on with the show in just a second, but first my sponsor would like a quick word. As gamers, we find it hard to deal with empty shelves, some worse than others. You therefore want a supplier that has what you need at affordable prices and delivers on time. For me, that supplier is KIENDA. They offer a discount on bulk purchases as well as a point scheme for future acquisitions down the line. If there's a hot title you're after, chances are KIENDA's got it. Wingspan? Mine. Arc Nova? Mine. Eclipse? Actually I hate that game, it's terrible, but you might like it. If you use the referral link in the description below and sign up for a new account, you'll get 5% discount on your first order over £60. So let's make gaps in your collection a thing of the past. Get down to KIENDA and start saving today. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the video.
Get on with it.
We're overdue for a top 10 list, aren't we? Yes, I spent all this time with a bunch of reviews from Essen, a bunch of reviews following Essen, some recent releases like crazy, Finspan and everything else, and then also the top 50. So a lot has been taking up my time and we haven't really sat down and just done an ordinary top 10 list. Well, there's a few top 10 lists that I think I need to, update as time has gone by. We'll see if we can get around to those in the next few months. But this is one that I've been wanting to do for a while because I have talked about different versions of this at other times, but no one's really sat down that often to deal with this particular account. Because I usually say that free players is the sweet spot for any Euro game. It's the good mix of having a little bit of interaction with other players, but the game not taking forever because you've got to wait for more people to take their turns. And 5 players, well, that's just a nightmare when it comes to most Euro games, so I've done a list on that, I think, ages ago in the past. What games would I play with 5? To do what games I'd play with 3 would just literally be about everything in existence, because 3 is typically the fantastic player count, but 4 is typically a good player count usually. But most of the time 4 just ends up crossing that line with, oh yeah, it's great, but I'd rather play it with 3. And as long as that is the case, then I'd rather play it with 3 rather than 4, because 4 tends to add more length to the game and not much else on top.
4 shalt thou not count, neither count thou 2.
So that's what this list is about. These are Euro games, specifically Euro games. We're not dealing with co-ops, we're not dealing with social deduction or anything like that. We are dealing pure, normal Euro games that we're used to, that I would rather play with 4 players out of all the player counts. And trust me, this list was not easy. I tried to come up with a list and there were some which are like, oh yeah, definitely, definitely, definitely. What the hell do I do with the rest? It's like it really was quite tough.
Hello? Hello, anybody home?
And I've got 10 games that fit here, but when I thought about all the games in my collection and other games I'd like to play, I'm like, free. It just became problematic trying to think of some that are like, yeah, do I prefer this with 4? I like it with 4, but then I'd rather have it with 3. And it's like, it's surprisingly very difficult. And believe me, I'll be very interested to hear your comments at the end of this as to which games you find that are great with 4 over all the other player counts that aren't on this list. And there are some on here that some of you have got to agree with, like hands down. I don't expect this one to be a particularly controversial list, but I'll be interested to know your thoughts. So without further ado, let's tackle into one of the hardest lists I've had to do in recent years. Top 10 games for 4 players.
Yes, get on with it!
So for my number 10, I can actually show you in this case. I'm not going to get out every game for all of these. It's just when I need to illustrate a point. But this is essentially a side effect to Carcassonne. Carcassone's no longer in the collection, and I've now got something called Small Islands, which I like to play instead. But this is kind of like a spin-off from that whole tile laying, create a little map in front of you, but with an element of bidding with other players. And this is Isle of Skye from Chieftain to King. And the primary reason for this comes sort of in twofold. Firstly, the player scaling with this dictates the length of the game and how many rounds you have, but also you've got this bidding phase where you put out tiles in front of you with a certain amount of money on, which is how much money you want other people to pay you for the tile. And you got to think, well, I want to sell this tile, but I want people to actually not be put off with the market, but then there might be a tile that you really want to keep, but you need to put some money on it, so you price it really high. And the idea with this is that there's 2 things that come from playing it with different players, because you can technically play this with up to 5 players, and I do not recommend 5. Firstly, the round amount. You get 6 rounds in a 2 to 4 player game, so you've got different scoring as each round goes on. So A, then B, then A and C, then B and D, then DAC, and then DBC. They're spread out quite nicely, and 6 rounds allows you to get quite a bit done. As soon as you play it with 5 players though, you lose a round and some stuff scores like quicker than it should do. The problem is some of these objectives are not easy to score in the early game, they're better for later, and so you end up wasting some of those objectives. And even when you do have one round knocked off, 5 players does take a while to get through that bidding phase, I find. So I'd much rather go through 6 rounds with 4 or less players than go through 5 rounds with 5. On top of that, you've also got the bidding phase itself. You put out 2 tiles in front of you and 1 you chop off. Well, if you get to 5 players, you have more tiles out, great, but maybe just too many, maybe a few too many for you to look at. But with 4, you get quite a nice amount of tiles and you can easily kind of see which tiles are out. But when you play with less players, there's not as many tiles to pick from. I mean, if you play with 2, there's very few tiles at all. But if you play with 3, you've only got really 4 tiles to look at, and they could just all be garbage. At least with 4 of you, you get a reasonable amount out there. So it's those couple of reasons that I just find that Isle of Skye, I think, works best at 4. I mean, I will play it with 3 players, and if I must, I'll play it with 5. But honestly, if I've got 4, and we just need something light that's into tile lane, I'll probably try and pull this one out.
It varies from moment to moment.
For my number 9, this is basically down to player scaling in terms of the worker placement aspect of it. This is one of the few games from Stoneware that I actually still give a decent amount of buzz to because it is still in my collection and still going strong. I'm not going to get it out specifically, but it is Viticulture. Viticulture, I think, works best at 4. Now, yes, the game takes a little bit less time with 3, but a lot of it is down to the way the boards scale. Because it's worker placement, you put workers out on the table and there are so many spaces for everybody. But it goes in sets of 2. So you've got solo and 2 player, and then you've got a new set for 3 and 4, and then you've got a new set for 5 and 6 in terms of how many spaces open up. And the problem I find is that if you play with 3 rather than 4, it's a little bit too easy to go to the spaces you want. I think 4 is a really good number for having a decent amount of tension for those spaces, particularly with the Tuscany board that has the different seasons. It's kind of less apparent when you play with just the base set, but with the Tuscany improved board, 4 players is very tight and very cool. So you're probably thinking, well, why don't you just play with 6 then? Because 6 players is ridiculous. Do you want to ever finish this wretched game, okay? You know, 5 and 6 is too many players. I don't like playing it with that. And the thing is, if you go up to 5, all you're doing is extending the length of the game and freeing up the spaces, because as soon as you go to the next bracket, you have more spaces than you need for the number of players. It's the same with 3. You know, you have the same amount of spaces available with 4 as you do with 3. So 3 just makes for a much more free roaming game, whereas 4 keeps it a bit more tighter. And I think the balance with this one is definitely keyed into 4 players. I just think that's a really good number to play it with, and I will play it with 3. This is not to say that 4 is the only count, but yeah, you're gonna be hard pressed to make me want to play this with 5 or 6. It's definitely not a count I like. I haven't even really played it solo in a while. You know, Viticulture has gone down in my list over time, but as a 3 to 4 player game, I still really enjoy it, and at 4, I think for worker placement scaling, it is the best at that count.
And everyone's titty much broadly fit chase.
Number 8 isn't even in my collection. I like the game and I respect it, but when I considered this list, I thought, well, I can't just go with games that are in my collection all the time. There has to be some exceptions to the rule, but it also depends on how much I enjoy the game. I mean, there are some games that are going to be prevalent at 4 players, and I will mention them in honorable mentions, but they're none on my list because I don't enjoy them as much. This one I didn't keep in my collection, but I still like it. It's a pure abstract strategy game, but if you play it with less than 4 players, it just isn't quite as cool as, you know, you don't butt heads as often, and that is Tigris and Euphrates. Or you can have Yellow and Yanked, whatever, pick your poison. They're both pretty much the same game, but with Tigris and Euphrates, you've got the same layout on the board, no matter how many players you have. So if you have 2 players, you just kind of at opposite ends and you do your own thing, and eventually you'll butt heads. 3, you might have 2 people going up against each other and one gets left out. 4 is perfect for Tigris and Euphrates. You know, you are all on this map, multiple players will butt heads, possibly even 3 at once, and it makes for a tighter board where people have to start butting heads. You know, you kind of feel like you can sit in your own corner with less players, and it's not anywhere near as fun. This is probably going to be one of the least controversial picks on this list. I think everybody who's a Tigris and Euphrates fan is always into 4 players.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
When I had this game in my collection, I only wanted to bring it out with 4. I just didn't feel like it was as good at 2 and 3 for me to, you know, go through the whole like teaching process. But yeah, it does lead to some pretty tense matches and some, you know, insane, crazy, you know, combats where you go, right, I put this tile down and now 3 of us are fighting in this. Right, you 2 are going to resolve first. Right, resolve your thing. Doom. Right, well that breaks up and now that means this needs to resolve. Right, okay, we'll do our thing. Right, well that breaks up. And
Boy, that escalated quickly.
it causes some good little chain reaction pieces to occur. There's a lot more interaction, and it's infinitely better at 4 players. I mean, is there anybody out there who doesn't agree with that?
Your mother.
Now, when it comes to my 7, we are talking about area control. Now, I'm not the biggest area control fan, it must be said. You know, it's definitely one of my lower mechanics that I go for. And so when I like an area control game, it's got to be one that I particularly like. Now, with area control, you might argue that more players is kind of key for them because you want a lot of people going at each other's throats, which is actually not an untrue statement, really. I mean, it does make some of them take a little bit too long, and maybe some of them make them a little bit too chaotic in that front. But with this particular one, I think 4 is the sweet spot because it's a mean game. Therefore, you want it at its meanest, and I still really enjoy it at 3 even. You know, I'll play this at 2 or 3 even, but Dominant Species, particularly Dominant Species Marine, and that's the one I'm going for in this case, I think does work at its maximum player count at 4 the best. And, you know, the game is not a short game anyway. It's going to take you a while to finish it, but, you know, you're making up your species, the map is building out, it will build out a lot more with 4 of you, and you're constantly at each other's throats trying to like dominate another species or grab the little token markers or, you know, get area control on the things before you score them and that. And you really do, I mean, like I say, works great at 3. I played it at 3 recently and I still really enjoy it, but with 4 of you, God blimey, it turns into a massive, like, you know, carnivorous meat fest at that point where everybody is just out to eat the other players for everything they've got. You know, you can't play Mr. Nice Guy in Dominant Species. It just does not work. No apologizing from me for like, no, I'm sorry I gotta do this. I know this is gonna hurt, but I need to do this. And it's like, no, you've got to take glee in what you're doing here because let's face it, it's just gonna come back at you with tenfold, you know, when you get into that situation. So, yeah, you know, area control games in general can be good at their max player count, but a lot of those area control games take a long time with them, or maybe I just don't enjoy the games as much. This is probably one of the few area control games in my collection, period. It's not a mechanic I go for generally. With this one, I think a lot of it is down to the theme. I like the theme of, you know, building up your little creatures, evolving them, and, you know, trying to survive with the different food and stuff. And the cards are a cool element. They can be a little bit swingy at times. I wish there was a way for the game to fix that problem. It's one flaw it does have. But otherwise, I do enjoy this one a lot more than I enjoy the previous version, because Marine has you do the actions one at a time, worker placement style, but with some restrictions, whereas the original Dominant Species, it goes up to 6, which is just way too long. 5 and 6 players is way too much, but it also requires you to program all your actions at a time, and that means you could spend half an hour on a round planning stuff just happens, your whole round is a waste of space, and that just deflates you like crazy. So I'm not the biggest fan of the original Dominant Species. This is the one I gun for, and if I can play it with 4, then fantastic.
Long live the king.
For number 6, we are going to a big heavy Euro. In fact, we're going to a heavier Euro than most. And the thing with this one is, one problem that you get in a lot of big Euros is downtime. So you're sitting there and you're thinking, with 4 of you, I've got to wait for 3 people to take their mammoth turns before it gets round to me. And you may have a situation even with this game where you could have a bit of downtime in between. But if you're playing the game properly, managing your influence and all that, you should be involved quite often. But it also makes for a much more tense worker placement aspect because you've only got 4 spaces in this entire game, and then there's 4 of you playing. So you're gonna trigger a lot of what's called kicked out actions on a regular basis. I'm talking, of course, now about the gallerist on my shelf. The gallerist has this rule where you go to a worker placement spot, you can leave agents behind, or you've just got your sort of big pawn there, and if somebody kicks you out of the action, when they're done doing their thing, you can either do a bonus executive action, bonus action for free, or you can spend influence up to a certain point to do one action at the spot you got kicked out of. Now, this does make it a bit of a nightmare to track whose turn it is at times, and certainly you might have a situation where you're sat waiting for about 3 to 4 turns to happen before it comes around to you. But if you're managing your spots carefully and doing what you need to do with your influence, you should be doing a bit of that yourself, and it means that you are deliberately trying to get people to kick you out. So you're interested in whether a player might go to a particular spot, in which case you might try and think, well, can I go to that spot first? Because then I get to do something, and then you get to kick me out, and I get to do more, There's things like that to consider. But with only 4 spaces on the board, 4 of you are kicking each other out, like left, right, and center. It's just constantly happening. There's rarely a time where somebody isn't being kicked out. And you're not necessarily going to spend influence every single time, but even just doing the bonus actions will at least keep you engaged in the game and not just sitting around twiddling your thumbs waiting for something to do. I certainly probably wouldn't suggest doing that maximum player count with all of the Lacerda games. I mean, on Mars, no. Lisboa, I'm happy enough playing that with free. Vinyos, I'm happy playing that with free. Kanban, Kanban's a tricky one. I quite like that with free. But I also quite like it with 4, but then I've also played it with 2. The 2-player mode works alright, that's the solo. So Kanban was a consideration, but I can play it with 3 or 4 and get about equal sort of going for it. But Gallerist has a specific reason why I want to play it with more. You play it with 3, you're not getting kicked out as often, even though the game is taking less time. I quite like having all those different kicked out actions happen on a regular basis. Just make sure you can keep track of whose turn it is.
How could I have been unthawed in the 90s and travelled back to... Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
My number 5 has had a resurgence lately, not just because it was on my top 50, but because since my top 50, I've actually played this game a few times by teaching it to people, and I've remembered just how much I love this game. In fact, at this rate, I wouldn't be surprised if it went up in my list for next year. I also need to check out the solo mode for it, now that I've actually printed out all the components for it. God, that took me a while. But this one, at 4 players, has more of you on the map, more of you getting each other's faces, more rules, more chances for diplomatic visits by using your caravans and that. But it certainly does make a difference when you play Civilization: A New Dawn with 4 rather than 2 to 4. In fact, I don't think this is a game I would want to play with 2 ever. 2 just seems way too few. And, 3 is good, but when you set up the map, you have 4 tiles on the board at the start if you have 4 or 5 players. This is not a game I want to play with 5, trust me, and you can only do 5 with the expansion. But, when you've got 2 or 3, you only have 2 tiles in the middle, and then you put stuff around the outside. So you might think, well, why don't you play this with 3? Well, the main reason is because A, I like to have a bigger map on these things. I mean, when you play a Civilization game, I want a big sprawling map to explore. I don't want just like 2 tiles and that's it. I found that was the case with what was it called, Brazil? Brazil. The map in that just felt very small and not that interesting for a Civ game. Whereas here you can expand and explore with the Terra Incognita expansion, which, let's face it, is essential for this. It's like a 10 out of 10 expansion. And so when you've got 4 of you, you've got more tiles out, but you've also got more people to visit.
Pleasure to be meeting you. Quite a pleasure.
Because you can send your caravans out to city-states and each other to get those diplomatic cards off each other. And if there's 2 of you that you're playing against, then, well, that's not as interesting as having 3 other players that you're playing against. It just makes for a more sprawling experience and a bigger map. And, lately I have been playing this with predominantly 4 players. I think I've played 3 games of this since, doing my top 50, and 2 of them were at 4 and 1 of them was at 3. And all 3 games were enjoyable, but the 4s just felt like there was more going on, more stuff happening, more interesting, twists happening with the board and the barbarians and that, because obviously having more tiles means more chance for barbarians, more spots to go to, more opportunities, and it just seems to... yeah, I think 4 is a sweet spot for this. And it kind of works the same with the original Civilization, the 2010 one I've still got down there. God blimey, that's going to be a fun one to try and learn the rules to at some point, because I've forgotten them all by now. But yeah, I think Civ games just benefit from having a lot of players. That is, Civ games with a map and a sprawling civilization. Something like Through the Ages, kind of going in the opposite direction on that one. Solo or 2-player, I'll stick with Through the Ages, but yeah, with Civ A New Dawn, I've just been really enjoying it at 4. It just seems to work.
Do you concur?
Right, I don't think anybody should be disagreeing with these next 4. These next 4 are definitely best at 4. It just has to be. Now, it may not include some obvious ones, but we'll get onto those with the honourable mentions. But this one is a game I've not played in my collection for quite some time. It's certainly, again, going down that whole area control thing, which, yeah, funny enough, after I did Dominant Species Marine, this one is definitely a game that really needs 4. Like, pretty much golden rule needs 4 when you're playing with this. And that is a game that is pretty much out of print, out of sight, out of phase, basically, with the known universe. Like, nobody is playing this anymore, but I refuse to get rid of it, because if I do, I'll never see it again. That is, here we go, Chaos in the Old World. Part of me now wants to really get this out again. And yeah, some people might recognize this as, I think this is one of the older covers actually. I think they redid the cover at one point. But this one I have expanded with the Horned Rat. And playing it with 5 is quite a long, event-filled game and a bit complicated. And not to mention that the Horned Rat as a faction is decent, but it's definitely different in power level to like balancing the other 4. The original 4 factions felt quite balanced. You know, some of them may be a little bit harder to grok than others. I mean, what you do is Khorne. You go out and kill things. It's pretty straightforward. You know, compared to something like Slaanesh or Tzeentch, which were a little bit more fiddly to do. But the 4 factions in the original game just kind of felt like they were made to go up against each other. Horned Rat feels like this 5th one just thrown into the mix that kind of upsets the balance even. So I don't often play with the Horned Rat as a faction, but if people want to play this with 4 players and they leave out one and use Horned Rat, I can't remember actually. Can you do that, or do you have to have 5? I forget, but with this game, it is a really solid one. You know, I mean, I have not played it in a while, I admit, but then I can say that about a few old games in the collection. Still got some player aids in there, but I think I even pimped it up slightly. Yeah, I got like special bags for it and everything. So it's a solid game. You know, you are at each other's throats, but the balance for this, I think, just works so much better with having the original 4 factions. Have those 4 Chaos Gods, Nurgle, Khorne, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. You know, have those 4, and you've got a pretty decent game. I mean, very few people without the expansion. Let's say the Horned Rat wasn't in your collection, because let's face it, that's harder to find than this is. But let's say you've just got the base game. How many of you felt like you really wanted to play it with 2? I mean, 2? Really? Or even 3? Because if you're missing one of the 4 gods, you feel like the game's kind of missing a component there. Like, you know, you've got the 3 gods going against each other, and it's like, well, you know, if we had this god, it would kind of counteract the one that you're doing there a little bit more. So you need all 4 of them in the game to really achieve that true balance.
The port is quite good.
Yes, quite good.
Indeed.
Most certainly.
What year is it?
51.
Ah,
Delectable.
indeed.
Yes.
Now, I've not played the, well, pseudo-sequel to this, whatever, Cthulhu Wars. I've not actually played that one. I wouldn't mind trying it out, but I don't know. I would just find myself drawn back to the good old classic original Chaos in the Old World with that board that looks like it's made out of skin and the Warhammer license. I think I'd just rather play that. But yeah, I'm never going to get rid of it because I'll never see it again. But yeah, at some point, I think this one needs to come off the resurrection pile, as I call it. The pile of games which have not been played in ages that seriously need playing again. You know, this is definitely one of those, and hopefully that time will come soon.
I admire its purity.
My number 3 was mentioned on my top 50 quite late. It was actually in my top 10 of all time, and this one is a light game. It's a light, generally very pretty Euro game, and I've had it since, like, I think the dawn of time. It's one of Bruno Cafala's best games, and I think with 4 players, Abyss just works that bit better, especially much better than 2-player. 2-player is just not worth it with Abyss, and even 3 with Abyss is fine, but I feel like I want 4 because the game doesn't take that long even with 4 players. The turns are very quick. I mean, you do the bidding with pearls and ally cards, or you take a stack of cards, or you buy a lord. It really doesn't equate to a lot of downtime. But the main reason you want to play this with 4 is because predominantly that ally bidding phase. Because when you take the depths action, you are flipping a card over and other players get to buy it off you in increasing the amount of cost. When there's 4 of you, there's a lot more people potentially buying off each other. There's a bit more turn angst. You know, you think, right, I'm 3rd in order. He's going to flip a card. Oh, are you likely to spend a pearl on it? Please don't, please don't, please don't. Yes, good, I'm buying it instead. And it's like, ah, crap, now I can't afford it. You know, so you get a bit more interaction with the players in that phase, and that's kind of the main reason why, actually. I mean, I know it's high up on this list, but by being high on the list, it's got to be not only like really good at this player count, but it's also got to be the player count that I specifically aim for with the game. And with this one, I think that bidding phase works. Now, Chaos in the Old World needed balancing with the factions to play it with 4, but then it does make for a longer game nonetheless because you're playing with more people. Here, Abyss doesn't take much longer with 4 of you compared to 3. It really isn't that long a game, but when you play with 2 or 3, you do notice that little bit of less interaction with the Pearl phase than to normal, and it just makes the game suffer a little bit more. 4 of you are going to be populating the stacks and the council row a lot more, so there's going to be more stuff to choose there. There's going to be more variety in the lords, because more will get bought. You know, there's just more going on, and given that the main emphasis of the game is the more you look at, the more you give your opponents, it's much better when you've got more opponents to actually give to, but potentially gain from. It just kind of works in that neat little balance. Right, my number 2 and my number 1 are paramount choices. Like, you cannot dispute that these games are best with 4. I mean, or could you? I don't know. I'm sure there's some of you out there that could, but this, again, was in my top 10 of all time. It is a game that I probably shouldn't like, but for some reason do, and it is one of my favorite games of all time. It is a theme that, again, I never expected to grab onto, and yet it works so well with this. But this is an asymmetric big 4-hour Euro, and if you want to get the full experience of this game, you need to play with the working class, the capitalist, the middle class, and the state. You gotta play with the 4 classes of Hegemony. Hegemony is perfectly good at 3. I'm not saying it's terrible at the other player counts, although at 2 it's a little lacking. Solo's fine, you get to play with as many bots as you like, so you could technically have a 3-player experience as solo. 2-player, I don't think works as well with Hegemony. I mean, it's decent, fine, but you're missing out on having no middle class and no state. With 3 of you, not having the state is not the end of the world. You've got the 3 main classes in there, but the state is a class I quite like to have in the game. I even quite like playing as a state. They get less actions to do, so it's not quite as involved as the others, but the state has to watch the other players. They have to gauge what's going on, they have to perceive the whole game and think, who's likely to be in a situation where they can run away with the game here? You are. I need to start helping you guys out more. How can I do that? You know, how can I curb you and help these? But then sooner or later that whole balance might switch, and then you've got to go, right, well, I've been helping them enough, so capitalists, let's talk. You know, it's such a fun little faction to play. But when you've got 4 of you in Hegemony, you have everything the game can offer. You've got all the different classes, you've got all the companies, all the the policies going left, right, middle and center like crazy. You've got the state trying to manipulate the game.
I never get involved in politics.
You've got the state benefits that they provide, which is great for the other 3. The events, which can give those players other bonuses, because that's kind of how the state, that's like the influence of the state, because otherwise, you just buy off the state as normal and there's not much else going on. But with an actual state player, they can really influence, you know, setting up some policy changes that are going to benefit certain players and getting support. But they're also doing the events that say, you know what, capitalist, you can have a little bit of extra money this turn. I need to do this event. And working class, you can have some more healthcare. There you go, it's available. You just got to buy it from me. And the state benefits, you know, right? Everybody's going to get a couple of extra education. There you go. Come on. Please take it. You know, you're kind of goading all the players. Still works great at 3. Perfectly fine to play Hegemony at 3 when it happens sometimes, but when I set this up at a convention, typically the whole 4 players will get used up, And I find a few players are unwilling to play the state as much, mainly because they don't have as many actions to pick from. But I quite like the state. I think I'm pretty good with the state and just I get a kick out of it. So if I want the state, I've got to play it with 4. But even then, I think just to get the full experience of the game, all the interaction that is most glorious that Hegemony provides, you want all 4.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed, bloody peasant!
Oh yeah, this number 1. When me and a few mates play it, we are adamant we play it with 4. We have to play this with 4. It has got the most tension for worker placement spots at 4. The game takes a while with 4, it has to be said, but the biggest reason is that the 2 and 3 player rules, with the neutral player and how it works, are really weird, they're badly written, and they're quite janky. They don't work as much. It is far better to have 4 of you playing, so you don't have any of those rules to contend with. You still have a ton of tension for the spaces, because there really isn't that many to go around with 4 of you, despite the fact there's a lot of spaces on the board. It's quite surprising how tight it can still be, but you've also got a bit more interaction with players, you know, thinking, right, well, I've got a bit of combat, I can kick you off, I can go share this space with you, you know, that kind of thing. Racing each other down the caravan track, you know, along the river. If you don't recognize this game, I'm not surprised, because a lot of people don't know this one, and that is Terra Mara. Terra Mara is a Quinid Games edition, which came out a few years ago at Essen. I played it, really enjoyed it, and then I grabbed it. It's one of my favorite worker placement games, and nobody talks about this game. I mean, nobody at all. I forget if I think it was in my top 50, and if it was probably in the lower end of it, but still really enjoyed this one, and it just never got any buzz. Very few people went to it, and I think some of it was down to Quinid Games just doing a piss poor job of actually advertising it, but also the fact that nobody really wants to play this game at 2 and 3 because of the janky neutral player rules. You know, it just doesn't. It's weird because a lot of Euro games have these sort of neutral player rules for 2 and 3, but for some reason this one just feels like it really lessens the game compared to a lot of those other ones. And most of the time you don't expect to play with a neutral player or, like, you know, neutral spaces taken up in a 3-player game. Normally you just flip the board over and have a little bit of a different board or something, but to have to go through this additional setup process to, you know, mess around with spaces and then having to do that on, like, you know, subsequent rounds as well, it just feels like extra effort and extra work, you know, basically slavery with extra steps for not much game, really. You know, we just always adamantly play this with 4. You know, when we're thinking like, well, how many of us we got? 3? Well, that's Terra Mara out then. We just pretty much don't even consider it. And so for that reason, it's going to be high up on this list, but you know, I can play Hegemony with 3 and I'll still be fine. The fact is, this one pretty much never gets played with less than 4, you know, and that's got to make a difference here. You know, all the other games on this list, they are best at 4, but I could still play them with 3 or a different player count. Terra Mara pretty much never hits the table or even consideration at less than 4. It always has to be 4, and for that reason, it's gonna be my number 1. Right, well there you go. That is my 10 through 1 of the top Euro games I like to play with 4 players. And I say 4 players is typically good for a lot of games, but with Euros, you gotta balance out that length, that interaction. So I find a lot of times I'd still rather play with 3. Not to say I will never play with 4, but there's always that limitation. But there's a lot of honorable mentions here, and I know some of you are basically kicking your monitor screens, wondering why some of these have not been mentioned. Don't worry, they're going to get mentioned here. So why don't we just kick off with the big obvious one that everybody's going to get on my case for. Where is Root? Yes, I get it. Root is definitely best played with a full player count of 4. I know you can probably have more with the expansions, but I think with the base game you had 4, and it definitely works best at 4. The problem is I have given Root as many chances as I can, and I don't mind it that much, but at best I can give it an average, above average rating. I've just never managed to get enough enjoyment from the game to consider it for a seal of endorsement. The problem is it's too fragile. When you play with people who don't know the game, it upsets the balance considerably. And the factions that they've brought in from expansions have got severe power creep compared to some of the others. Or power creep or power diminishing, I don't know. Because you've got ones like the Crocodile Cult, which sounded like great on paper to play, and they turned out to be one of the worst factions I've ever played. They're just so powerless, they're crap. But then a friend of mine plays like the Rat faction, you know, the ones who just go and invade with rats. They're stupidly powerful. It's ridiculous. You have to like curb them at the very start, otherwise they would just overrun the board with all their abilities and stuff. The problem is, if you got new players to the game, how are you supposed to do that? I mean, I digress. You could have a whole conversation about this, but this is the thing. Root has never impressed me enough to be worth, you know, considering for my collection, or like I say, this list. It's an honorable mention because I totally agree with you that it's best played at the 4-player count, with the base set that is, and it's probably most balanced at that stage, you know, so totally with you on that. It's just not a game I enjoy as much as I like. I even tried the app. I might even still have the app. It's one of the best apps out there, I'll give it that. You know, I give the game a lot of respect and credit, but it's way too fragile for my liking. It's just, it's not, it doesn't sit with me as well, but I could not mention it because I would have my head taken off if I didn't. Alright, Innis I considered. Innis not been in the collection for a while. It's hard to teach. It needs the expansion to, you know, curb the game length issue. But yeah, with Innis, you really wanted to play this with the max player count of 4, didn't you? You know, I think it was max 4. Maybe the expansion added another one, I'm not sure. But, you know, generally, you didn't want to play this area control game with a twist with 2, and not even as much with 3. You wanted a lot of people on the board going at each other's throats, and so Innis just worked better at 4. Empires of the Void 2 I kind of consider, because you can play this with 5, but I think 5 is a little bit too long. But the thing is that the board scales by replacing a bunch of the planets with these generic neutral foes that are stupidly hard to kill, that the only way you can possibly kill them is to go heavy into combat. So it basically just nullifies a bunch of the board. So when you play with less players, you've got less cool stuff to look at. 4 is the sweet spot, where you've got a decent amount of the board to look at, you know, 1 or 2 neutral planets that you can potentially go for, and they're not taking quite as long as a 5-player game, which goes a little bit ridiculous. Architects of the West Kingdom, put it as an honourable mention, but in all fairness, maybe this one isn't as much of an honourable mention, because yes, it's definitely great with 4, but with the expansions, it's actually pretty decent at 5 and 6. You know, you actually can get through the game reasonably quick, even with 5 or 6 players, because the turns are just so snappy and fast. And when you've got lots of you putting each other in prison and God knows what else, 5 and 6 actually does become quite fun. But certainly if you've only got the base game, you play it with 4, really. Let's see, The King is Dead. Quick little, well, I say quick, it takes ages because everyone gets analysis paralysis with this game. But it's a cool, quirky game. It's area control with cubes, you know, limited rounds, limited cards and stuff. But yeah, you really want 4, don't you? You want 4 of you on this map going at each other, because you know, again, it's area control, and I think area control games tend to benefit more from having more players. I just don't enjoy the mechanic as much, but I was kind of surprised about The King is Dead. It's actually still on my shelf downstairs. You know, it's a game it's clever. It's really clever, and you don't realize it at first, but you know, definitely you want 4 players when you're playing it. The War of the Ring card game. I just played this last Tuesday, in fact, actually, and it has problems. I do wish it wasn't skewed to the evil players in terms of power level. You know, it's much easier to win with the evil players than it is to win with the good players, but it's still a great game. And you want to play it with 4, really. I mean, you can play it with 3, but that's kind of weird. You could play it with 2, and it works fine at 2, but you really want to play 2-handed, because 1 deck against 1 deck, I don't know, it's just not as interesting. You really want all 4 of the decks in play, and for that, I'd just rather have 4 of you at the table. A little bit of teamwork with each other, you know, 2 different minds, you know, talking about what they want to do. The game doesn't take that much longer, really. It just feels like the 2v2 is the way to play. Not to say the 1v1 is bad. It's still pretty damn decent at 1v1, but yeah, I don't really want to play this with 3. Having a 2v1 thing is just, I don't know, it's kind of weird. It's extra rules, it's more jankiness you got to learn. This is definitely a 2 or 4 player game. Scythe, you can go up to 5, 6, or 7 players now. 4 just seems to be a good little sweet spot of having enough people on the board and not having the game take forever. That being said, I have played a 7-player game of Scythe in 90 minutes before, but that's with people who knew how to play the game, and with a friend of mine who I haven't seen in ages, who, you know, basically is the ultimate moderator for a game. This guy can get you to play a Twilight Imperium 4 game in 3 hours with, like, max player count. He could, because he just has this knack of being able to get people to make their moves and get the game ticking and going. Like, no just sitting around, no flim-flam. It's pretty impressive. And the last one is Cerebria: The Inside World. It's since left the collection. It's a bit too hard to get to the table, and part of that is because you really want to play it 2v2. It's a lot to comprehend by yourself with 1v1, but when you got 2v2, that teamwork aspect with the 2 different emotions that you play on light side and 2 on the dark side, you know, it just has a much better dynamic. The problem is, it's a nightmare to find 4 of you that can play a game that is made by Mind Clash with a decent amount of reliability. It's just a lot of rules to teach and way too impractical, so I had to get rid of it, despite the fact I enjoy it. But yeah, it definitely was a consideration for 4 players. And there you go. Now I'd be very interested to know if there's any games that you would like to play with 4 that I did not mention on the list. Now, I'd be interested to know the reasons why. I mean, for example, some of you might go, you know, well, what about Brass Birmingham? Well, A, I can't stand brass, but B, really, I mean, it's, you know, it might make the board a little bit tighter, but you're just adding to the length of the game, and at the end of the day, I don't like brass, so it was never going to be a consideration. But yeah, by all means, let me know which games you prefer to play it for, and you must stick to Euro games. I don't want co-op games, I don't want social deduction, I don't want like Amerifrash, skirmish games, miniature games, that kind of thing. You know, I mean, you might argue that something like War of the Ring, the card game, is a little bit weird out of that region, but then I didn't put it on my list, so what are you worried about? But yeah, if it wasn't on my honorable mentions, or it wasn't in my 10, let me know your thoughts and give me the reasons why. So that's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. If you like what you see, then please thumb it up on YouTube, and by all means consider subscribing to the channel to be notified about other videos, or subscribe to the Patreon to help keep this channel running, because it is a side hobby, it is not my day job, and so I've got to find time and of course funds in order to keep it running. And for those of you who are subscribed to it, thank you very much. Your support is always appreciated and in some ways essential. By all means, let me know your thoughts down below, you know, as I've mentioned. And until next time, remember, regardless of whether with the Holy Hand Grenade you refuse to count to 4, it's still only a game. So bye for now.